On June 21, 2026, the Brookings Institution published a report written by three of the most senior American Middle East policy architects of the past 2 decades, with a conclusion so stark it barely registered in the news cycle. The report stated that the strategic framework the United States has operated in the Middle East since 2003 had, quote, failed to produce durable outcomes in any of its primary objectives. Not some objectives, not most objectives, any of its primary objectives. Hold that phrase. Because 24 hours later, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood at a podium in Washington and stated with complete confidence that American strategy in the region was, quote, working. He used that word specifically. Working, these two things cannot both be true. Either three of the most credentialed American foreign policy minds with combined access to decades of classified briefings are wrong, or the Secretary of State is using a definition of working that requires you not to look at what the strategy was designed to produce. Today I am going to show you which one is closer to reality. Right now the Washington Post is running analyses about Iranian nuclear timelines. Politico is writing about congressional authorization debates. CNN is covering the latest Gulf shipping incident. All of them are describing the symptoms. None of them are diagnosing the disease, the right question, the one that actually determines the next decade of American foreign policy. Is this, what was the American Middle East strategy actually designed to do? Has it done that thing? And what does the answer tell us about what Iran has actually accomplished? In the next 25 minutes, I am going to walk you through the strategic architecture America built after 2001, the 4 structural failures that Iran's actions have exposed in that architecture, and why the Brookings report is not a critique of one administration's policy, but an epitaph for a 20-year strategic framework. By the end of this, you will understand the Middle East situation not as a news cycle, but as a strategic endgame. And you will see the one actor that has positioned itself to define what comes next. I call this the imperial overextension model. And I want to ground it immediately in something that is not a theory, but a historical pattern. Edward Gibbon, writing The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, identified a specific mechanism he called the burden of the frontier. Rome, at its peak, maintained stability through a network of client states, forward bases, and military presences along its borders. That network was not a weakness, it was what made Rome Rome. But it carried a cost. The frontier had to be funded, garrisoned, and managed continuously, and the further it extended, the more it cost to maintain. At some point, and Gibbon's insight was that there is always such a point. The cost of maintaining the frontier exceeds what the imperial center can extract from the empire it is protecting. When that point arrives, the empire does not collapse from external defeat. It collapses from the internal unsustainability of its own defensive perimeter. The United States is not Rome. This analogy is always abused. So let me be specific about what I am claiming. I am claiming that the American strategic presence in the Middle East has reached a point where the cost of maintaining it exceeds what the strategic presence produces in return. That is an economic and political claim, not a civilizational one. And Iran's actions over the past 5 years have been the instrument that made the gap visible. There are 4 structural failures that Iran's strategy has exposed in the American Middle East framework. Let me walk through them in order. The first structural failure is what I call the basing vulnerability revelation. The United States maintains approximately 30,000 military personnel in the Middle East, spread across bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Jordan, and Iraq. This forward basing network was designed to project power, deter aggression, and provide rapid response capability across the theater. It was the physical expression of American strategic primacy in the region. What Iran has systematically demonstrated through its support for Iraqi militias that have launched hundreds of drone and rocket attacks against American bases since 2019. Through Houthi drone and missile campaigns that have disrupted Gulf shipping and threaten regional basing, and through the escalation dynamics of October 2024, is that the forward basing network is not only a power projection asset, but an exposure. It is 30,000 people and billions of dollars of equipment in a theater where the adversary can impose costs on them at a price point, as we discussed, of roughly $50,000 per attack. The bases that were designed as deterrence assets have become the primary leverage Iran holds over American decision-making. Every time Washington considers military action against Iran, it must account for what happens to those 30,000 personnel in the first 24 hours of an Iranian response. The basing network, which was supposed to make American threats credible, now functions as a constraint on American action. The strategic asset has become a strategic liability, not because the bases got weaker, because the threat environment around them was methodically engineered to make them hostages. Okay? Does that sit right? Let me show you the second failure. The second structural failure is the alliance architecture deterioration. American Middle East strategy since 2003 has been premised on a set of bilateral relationships with Gulf Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait, that provided basing rights, diplomatic support, and economic alignment in exchange for American security guarantees. That architecture rested on three assumptions: that the Gulf states shared American threat perceptions, that they would prioritize a relationship with Washington over any regional accommodation with Iran, and that American security guarantees were credible enough to underwrite the political cost Gulf states paid for alignment with Washington. All three assumptions have been exposed as weaker than planners believed. The 2023 Saudi-Iran normalization agreement, brokered by China, is the single most significant data point in this analysis. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the American Gulf Alliance architecture, the state whose security is backed by the most explicit American security commitments in the region, chose to normalize relations with its primary adversary through a Chinese process rather than an American one. This is not a minor diplomatic adjustment. This is a signal that Riyadh believes its long-term security calculus is better served by regional accommodation than by maintaining the adversarial posture that American strategy required of it. The alliance did not collapse, but its exclusive character did. And an alliance that is no longer exclusive is no longer a reliable strategic asset. The third structural failure is the democracy promotion and state building bankruptcy. And I want to be careful here because this point is more contested than the first two. The stated rationale for American military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the secondary rationale for American support for various regional actors over the 2 decades following included a component of building liberal, democratic, stable states that would be natural partners for American interests and natural competitors to Iranian influence. The outcome of that effort, measured not by intentions, but by results, is documented in that Brookings report. Iraq today is a state where the government is formally allied with Washington, but its military is thoroughly interpenetrated by Iranian-aligned militia structures, where the prime minister maintains working relationships with both American and Iranian leadership simultaneously, and where Iranian political influence is arguably more durable than American. Political influence, despite the fact that the United States spent approximately $2 trillion and nearly 4,500 American military lives to reshape that country. Not a partial success, not a mixed record. The primary state building investment of the American Middle East strategy produced a state that now functions as an Iranian strategic asset operating within a formal American alliance framework. That is not a policy failure. That is a policy inversion. The fourth structural failure is the most fundamental and the most difficult to acknowledge. I call it the strategic purpose deficit. Military and diplomatic strategies are means. They must serve defined ends. The ends that American Middle East strategy was designed to serve: preventing a regional hegemon from dominating the Gulf, securing energy supply lines, preventing the emergence of hostile state sponsors of terrorism with weapons of mass destruction, and maintaining an Israeli security environment that allows the Israeli state to function without existential threat have each been partially or substantially degraded over the 20-year implementation period. Iran's nuclear program is further advanced than it was in 2003. Iranian-supported non-state actors have more regional influence than in 2003. American energy dependence on Gulf supply lines is substantially lower due to domestic shale production, which ironically removes one of the primary strategic rationales for the forward-basing presence. And Israeli security, as of 2024 and 2025, involves a more active and complex threat environment from Iranian-aligned forces than at any point in the previous 2 decades. The strategy did not fail to be implemented. It was implemented extensively, expensively, and continuously. The outcomes moved in the wrong direction anyway. That is not a resource problem. That is a conceptual problem. Now I want to give you the most serious counter-argument, because it deserves to be heard. The counter-argument to the imperial overextension model is this. American strategy in the Middle East has actually succeeded at its most fundamental objective. There has been no hegemonic takeover of the Gulf by any hostile power, no successful acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran, and no collapse of the global energy market infrastructure that runs through the Strait of Hormuz. These are not small achievements. The counterfactual, what the Middle East looks like without 2 decades of American presence and engagement, might be substantially worse by any measure. The Pax Americana, even an imperfect and costly one, is better than the available alternatives. A declining empire that still prevents worse outcomes is not the same as a failed strategy. This is a genuinely strong argument, and I respect it. Here is what it cannot explain. The American forward-basing presence has not prevented Iranian nuclear advancement. It has, if anything, accelerated the political incentives for it. It has not produced the stable regional partner states it was designed to produce. Iraq and Afghanistan are the evidence, not the theory. And the argument that American presence prevents worse outcomes rests on an unfalsifiable counterfactual, while the costs of the current situation are measurable and present. Most importantly, the argument that a strategy is worth continuing because stopping it might be worse is the definition of a sunk cost trap. Rome's generals made the same argument about the frontier. They were not wrong in the short term. They were wrong in the long term. Let me synthesize. The American Middle East strategy rested on a framework of forward-basing deterrence, exclusive alliance architecture, state building as strategic investment, and military superiority as political leverage. Iran's actions over 2 decades have systematically exposed each component of that framework as weaker than design. The bases are liabilities. The alliances are no longer exclusive. The state building produced the opposite of its intended outcome. And military superiority without political usability is not leverage, it is expense. The Brookings report is not a partisan critique. It is a systems assessment. And the system is not working, not in the definition of working that requires it to produce its stated objectives. And here is the actor nobody in that Brookings report names as the primary beneficiary of the American strategic unraveling. China's single largest strategic objective in the Middle East is not to build influence in the Gulf. It is to ensure that the Gulf remains an environment where the United States cannot sustain a unipolar security order, because a multipolar Gulf is a Gulf where China's energy supply lines are not controlled by any single adversarial power. China does not need to win the Middle East. It needs America not to hold it alone. And over 20 years, at a fraction of the cost America has spent trying to maintain its strategic primacy, China has watched Iran do the work. The Saudi normalization brokered in Beijing was China's most explicit claim to regional strategic relevance, and it was accomplished not through military presence, but through diplomatic positioning inside a space that American overextension had opened. The empire clock is ticking. It always does. And the patient giant is, as always, reading the board. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch any statements from Gulf Arab governments about American security guarantees. specifically any language about strategic diversification or regional balance. This is the diplomatic vocabulary of states that are hedging away from exclusive reliance on Washington. Second, watch whether the Iraqi Prime Minister makes any public statement positioning Iraq as a potential mediator between Washington and Tehran. Iraqi mediation positioning is the clearest signal that Baghdad has decided its strategic future lies between the two powers rather than within one camp. Third, watch what China's foreign ministry says about Gulf stability. If Beijing's language shifts from observer to guarantor, that is Beijing making a formal claim to the strategic role America is vacating. Your homework is this. Read the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, specifically the sections on Middle East transformation, and then read the Brookings Institution's 2026 report on American Middle East strategy outcomes. Hold the stated objectives in the first document against the documented outcomes in the second. Tell me in the comments which objectives were achieved, which were partially achieved, and which moved in the opposite direction. I want that accounting in the comments. I genuinely believe someone in this community will do it more rigorously than most think tanks. Here is the question I want to leave you with. When a strategy is implemented fully, funded generously, and sustained for 2 decades, and the region it was designed to shape is less aligned with its objectives than when the strategy began, is the problem the strategy, the implementation, or the assumption that the region could be shaped at all? I will see you in the next one.